In the quiet suburbs of Belleville, Illinois, 1991, Cindy Sarro was a woman haunted before she ever moved a single box. For weeks, a recurring nightmare clawed at her sleep. It was always the same. She was being pursued through a house she didn't recognize. Her feet heavy, her breath hitching as she scrambled up a specific, dark wooden staircase. The dream always ended the same way, just as the unseen shadow reached for her. She would wake up, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. At the time, Cindy dismissed it as the stress of house hunting. She and her boyfriend, Glenn, were looking for a fresh start for their 2 young daughters, Brooke and Christy. They found it in Caseyville, a secluded property nestled near the dense woods of Cannonball Hill. It looked like a sanctuary, but the moment Cindy stepped across the threshold for the initial walkthrough, the air in the room didn't just feel cold, numbing stillness took hold of her. As she turned the corner into the main hallway, her blood turned to ice. There it was, the staircase. Every grain of wood, every curve of the banister, every shadow cast by the landing was identical to the structure in her nightmares. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a blueprint. Most people would have turned and run. But in the rational world of 1991, dreams don't dictate real estate investments. They signed the papers, they moved in, and the nightmare, no longer confined to the REM cycle, began to breathe in the waking world. What follows is one of the most documented and disturbing accounts of domestic haunting in Illinois history. This isn't just a ghost story, it is a clinical record of a family's disintegration. We are looking at a case where the anomalies weren't just bumps in the night. We are talking about physical evidence documented by medical professionals, electrical failures that defied the laws of physics according to licensed contractors, and a history of the land that suggests the house on the hill was built on a foundation of unresolved trauma. Within the first 24 hours, the house signaled its rejection of the new occupants. It started with the water. When Cindy tried to bathe her children, the taps didn't produce clear water, they vomited a thick, ink-black sludge. Plumbers found no rust, no pipe decay, and no logical source for the contamination. It was as if the house itself was bleeding. Then came the midnight cycle. Cindy discovered that her body was no longer her own. Every night, at the exact stroke of 12, while the rest of the world slept, Cindy would be subjected to violent, invisible physical assaults. Marks appeared on her skin, bruises, welts, and internal injuries later confirmed by doctors to be consistent with blunt force trauma. Yet there was never an intruder in the room. The tension within the walls began to warp the people inside. Glenn, a man with no history of violence, began to exhibit personality shifts that bordered on the unrecognizable. The children spoke to things that weren't there, and all the while, the history of Cannonball Hill loomed over them, a site of 19th-century mining disasters and forgotten casualties. How does a dream become a physical cage? Is it possible for a location to retain the energy of those who suffered there a century prior? In this investigation, we move past the sensationalism to look at the official records, the library archives that went missing, and the terrifying encounter with a stranger named Daryl who seemed to know the house's secrets better than the owners themselves. Welcome to a deep dive into the Sarro case. We are not here to convince you of the supernatural. We are here to present the facts of a 3-month ordeal that forced a family to abandon everything they owned to escape a predator made of wood and stone. This is the house on the hill. Objective, clinical, terrifying. The transition from Belleville to Caseyville was supposed to be a logistical victory for Cindy Sarro. The new property offered more than just square footage, it promised a connection to family. Situated just a short walk through the timber from both Glenn's and Cindy's mothers. But the physical environment of the house seemed to resist their presence from the very hour they received the keys. The first mechanical red flag was subtle but bizarre. The windows on the ground floor. Despite being standard frames, they were effectively sealed shut, as if they were decorative rather than functional. Cindy noted in her records that it felt as though the house was designed to prevent airflow. Or perhaps, to ensure that once someone entered, the threshold was absolute. The first night in the house stripped away any remaining illusions of domestic peace. As Glenn worked to troubleshoot a malfunctioning air conditioning unit, Cindy attempted to sell her daughters, Brooke and Christy. Into a routine. The girls were sent to the bathroom to cool off from the humid Illinois heat. But the sound that followed was not the splashing of water, but a chorus of screams. When Cindy rushed to the bathroom, she witnessed a phenomenon that would later be cited as one of the most inexplicable aspects of the case. The water coming from the faucets was a viscous, pitch black liquid. This was not the brownish tint of rusted pipes or the sediment of a disturbed well. This was an ink-like sludge that stained the porcelain immediately. Cindy attempted to run a load of laundry to test the system, only to find her clothes emerged covered in a black residue that defied standard cleaning. When a professional was later brought in to inspect the plumbing, the report was unsettling. The pipes were in functional condition, and the well water was tested, yet no biological or mineral source for the black sludge could be identified. It was a localized anomaly that seemed to target the Sarro family's basic needs. Forced to bathe her children at her mother's apartment, Cindy returned to the house alone to continue unpacking, only to find the interior environment becoming increasingly hostile. As she opened the kitchen cabinets, the doors began to detach from their hinges one by one, falling to the floor without any structural provocation. Simultaneously, the electrical system began a pattern of erratic behavior that would plague the family for the duration of their stay. The lights did not simply flicker, they dimmed to near total darkness before surging back to a blinding intensity. A cycle that felt intentional rather than mechanical. By the second night, the children's intuition began to manifest as physical avoidance. Brooke and Christy, who had been excited about their brand new bunk beds, refused to enter their bedroom. Brooke, only 9 years old at the time, emerged from the room with a flushed face and a singular, chilling statement. She simply could not be in that space. This forced a reorganization of the home's sleeping arrangements that would eventually leave the bedrooms abandoned. Glenn, who worked nights at a chemical plant in St. Louis, would sleep in the bedroom during the day, while Cindy and the girls retreated to the living room couches, effectively barricading themselves in the most open area of the house. It was during these late-night vigils on the couch that the physical phenomena transitioned from environmental to personal. Cindy began to experience what she described as targeted, localized sensations. While dozing off, she felt a sharp, violent tug on her eyelashes, an act of precision that required a physical proximity that was impossible in an empty room. When she sat up to investigate, she was met with a heavy, blunt impact to her arm. These were not the creaks and groans of an old house, these were kinetic applications of force. To document these occurrences, Cindy began to track the timing. She realized that the house operated on a schedule. The most intense activity coincided with the midnight hour, specifically aligned with the broadcast of late-night talk shows she used for background noise. The wall behind her couch became a focal point of dread. Cindy reported that she could feel a rhythmic vibration emanating from the dry wall. A heaving sensation as if something was breathing or moving within the structural voids of the house. This was the moment the Sarro family realized they weren't dealing with a series of unfortunate maintenance issues. They were dealing with a systemic rejection. The house was not just malfunctioning, it was reacting to their heartbeat, their movement, and their presence. The psychological weight of the arrival phase cannot be overstated. In official interviews, Cindy emphasized that the most terrifying part was the lack of an identifiable enemy. There were no shadows in the corner yet, only the black water, the falling doors, and the invisible hands that had begun to leave physical marks on her body. She reached out to an electrician to address the surging lights, hoping for a scientific explanation that would restore her sense of reality. The electrician's findings, however, only pushed the case further into the realm of the impossible. He discovered that the internal wiring of the house had been physically reversed, not by age or wear, but in a manner that suggested deliberate, manual tampering. Yet, no one had access to the crawlspaces or the internal panels except the family. As the first week concluded, the Sarro family found themselves living out of suitcases in their own living room, surrounded by a house that had effectively shut them out of its bedrooms and poisoned its own water supply. The sanctuary they had bought near Cannonball Hill had transformed into a pressurized environment, and the first cracks in the family's emotional foundation were beginning to show. The arrival was over, the occupation had begun. as the Sarro family entered their second month in the Caseyville residence. The environmental anomalies matured into direct, targeted violence. This period, known in the case files as the escalation, is marked by a shift from structural malfunctions to the physical and psychological erosion of the inhabitants. The house was no longer merely rejecting the family, it was actively deconstructing them. Cindy Sarro's daily logs began to reflect a harrowing reality. The midnight cycle had evolved from simple tugs on her hair into full-scale physical battery. Cindy reported being kicked in the lower back and punched in the abdomen by an invisible force with such velocity that it left internal trauma. One of the most clinically significant aspects of this phase was the manifestation of physical injuries that were later corroborated by medical examinations. Cindy, who already suffered from a pre-existing ruptured disc in her lower spine, found that the invisible attacks were precisely targeted at her most vulnerable physical points. During several episodes described as out-of-body experiences or astral projections, she claimed to feel her bones literally cracking under the pressure of an unseen weight. These were not psychosomatic symptoms. Subsequent medical visits revealed blood in her urine, a clear clinical indicator of acute kidney trauma or blunt force impact to the lower torso. The objective reality of these injuries provided a grim counterpoint to any claims that the haunting was merely a product of domestic stress. While Cindy bore the brunt of the physical violence, the psychological atmosphere of the home began to alter the personalities of everyone within it. A profound breakdown of the family dynamic took root, characterized by uncharacteristic aggression and emotional volatility. Glenn, previously a steady partner, began to exhibit symptoms of extreme personality displacement. The house seemed to drive a wedge between the couple, fueling intense arguments over the house's mounting defects. However, the friction went beyond mere stress. Cindy recalled an incident where Glenn's voice and demeanor shifted entirely. He attempted to suffocate her with an oversized pillow in their bedroom. An act of sudden, lethal aggression that he later seemed to have no memory of, or at least, no rational explanation for. This possession-like behavior suggested that the environment was not just attacking the body, but was also infiltrating the mind. The isolation of the family became absolute as the house began to project its hostility toward visitors. Cindy's mother, who suffered from lupus, found that she could no longer enter the property without becoming deathly ill almost instantly. Friends and extended family members reported a pervasive sense of being watched from the dark corners of the rooms. Cindy's nephew, Brandon, who was exceptionally close to the family, refused to stay even for a single night, claiming the atmosphere was too heavy to breathe. A cousin, Angie, was struck by a headache so blinding and sudden that she had to be helped from the house, while another niece reported the sensation of a cold, predatory stare following her every move. The house was effectively pruning the family's support system, leaving them alone in a state of high-alert survival. Technological interference during this period also served to heighten the family's sense of entrapment. The telephone line, the only link to the outside world, became a tool of psychological warfare. Cindy would attempt to call her mother for help, only to find the line dead. When repairmen from the phone company arrived, they repeatedly found the line to be perfectly functional, often with a clear dial tone that vanished the moment the technician left the property. The electrician returned as well, only to find that the wiring he had previously corrected had been physically reversed once again. He famously remarked to the family that he wanted to leave as quickly as possible, noting that the electricity seemed to jump at him from the switches. This consistent pattern of mechanical re-sabotage suggested an intelligence that understood the house's infrastructure and was intent on keeping the family in a state of primitive darkness. Even the family's animals were not immune to the escalation. Cindy documented a terrifying change in their dog's behavior. One evening, she observed the dog's eyes reflecting a strange, unnatural green glow that was inconsistent with normal ocular reflection. The next morning, a heavy 5-gallon water container, far too heavy for the dog to move, was found relocated across the yard. Bone dry, with not a single drop of water spilled on the ground. The physical laws of displacement and gravity were being routinely flouted. The most disturbing development, however, involved the children. Brooke and Christy, once vibrant and healthy, became withdrawn and fearful. A neighbor's son, Sean, who frequently played with the girls, began to exhibit a chilling prescience. On Cindy's birthday, October 10th, Sean told the girls that Cindy would be nailed to the wall at midnight. When confronted, the boy had no explanation for his words, acting as though he were merely a mouthpiece for something else. This was followed by an incident where Glenn, while working on the roof, was threatened by the same child, who claimed he wanted to split his head wide open. The children were no longer safe, and the house was no longer just a backdrop, nerved by the history of Cannonball Hill. It had become a predatory participant in their lives. By the end of this phase, the Sarro family was living in a state of total siege. Cindy had ceased sleeping almost entirely, paralyzed by the fear that if she closed her eyes, she would not wake up in her own body. The house had successfully eroded their health, their relationship, and their connection to reality. The escalation had reached its peak. The family was no longer living in a home. They were being held captive by a geographic location that seemed to demand their total psychological and physical submission. The stage was set for the final, terrifying manifestations that would eventually force them to abandon the property forever. The transition from haunted house to crime scene of the soul was complete. As the physical environment of the house became increasingly untenable, Cindy Sarro shifted her focus from mere survival to an objective investigation. She realized that the house was not an isolated system, it was a structure sitting atop a complex geographical and historical layer. The search for answers led her to the local archives and the history of Caseyville, specifically the area known as Cannonball Hill. To maintain the integrity of this investigation, we must look at the documented industrial history of St. Clair County, which reveals a landscape defined by rapid expansion and frequent tragedy. The primary historical anchor for the anomalies is the coal mining industry that dominated this region in the late 19th century. Records from the Illinois State Geological Survey confirm that the ground beneath Caseyville is a labyrinth of abandoned mine shafts. In 1881, the local area was the site of several significant mining accidents where safety protocols were primitive and casualties were high. These mines were often unstable, and squeeze events, where the weight of the earth crushes the support pillars, were common. For Cindy, this provided a potential non-supernatural framework. Was the house being affected by infrasound or structural vibrations from shifting mine voids? However, the archives offered a more specific, personal connection to the phenomena. During her research at the Belleville Public Library, Cindy began to uncover a series of deaths associated with the very land her house occupied. One particular record stood out: a local resident who had passed away under unusual circumstances decades prior. As she dug deeper, she encountered a bizarre obstacle. When she requested specific microfilm newspapers from certain dates she believed were critical to understanding the property's past, she was told those specific rolls were missing or had been damaged. This gap in the public record added a layer of systemic mystery to the case. It suggested that the history of the house on the hill was not just tragic, but perhaps intentionally obscured. The investigation then pivoted to the man in the van, an encounter that remains one of the most disturbing chapters of the Sarro case. While Cindy was outside the property, a stranger driving a vintage van approached her. Without prompting, the man, who identified himself only as Daryl, began to recite specific dates of tragedies that had occurred on the hill. He spoke with a clinical detachment, describing a soldier and a child associated with the land. He warned Cindy that the house would never allow her to find peace because the balance had been disturbed. When Cindy later attempted to verify the dates Daryl provided, she found they aligned perfectly with the mining accidents and property disputes found in the fragments of the remaining archives. Daryl was never seen again, and his identity was never verified by local authorities, leaving him as a spectral informant in the official record. This period of the investigation also looked into the soldier apparition, reported by several family members. Unlike typical horror tropes, the description of this figure was remarkably consistent: a man in a period-accurate military uniform who appeared not as a threat, but as a sentinel. Cindy's research into the Civil War history of southern Illinois revealed that Cannonball Hill had indeed been a lookout point and a site of minor skirmishes. The removal of a large flag from the property by the previous owners, an act Cindy learned about through neighbors, coincided with the beginning of the soldiers' appearances. This suggested a residual haunting model, where intense emotional or historical events are recorded into the environment and replayed when the physical space is altered. Furthermore, the geological composition of the hill itself became a point of interest. The high quartz and limestone content in the Illinois soil is known by some researchers to act as a natural conductor or battery for electromagnetic energy. When combined with the high-voltage power lines that ran near the property and the subterranean voids of the coal mines, the house was sitting in a literal, perfect storm of energy conductors. This objective data provides a bridge between the subjective experiences of the family and the physical reality of the location. However, the most chilling discovery wasn't in the ground, but in the missing paperwork. Cindy discovered that the property had a high turnover rate. Families would move in and abandon the home within months, often leaving behind furniture and personal belongings in their haste. These families, when tracked down, refused to speak on the record, citing a desire to move on from a dark chapter. This pattern of rapid abandonment, corroborated by local real estate records, proved that the Sarro family was not an outlier. They were part of a repeating cycle. By the end of this 5-minute deep dive into the archives, the investigation had stripped away the idea that the haunting was a random occurrence. It revealed that the house on the hill was a focal point for a century of localized trauma, mining deaths, military history, and unexplained disappearances. Cindy Sarro had successfully mapped the why of her situation. But the how remained a violent, daily reality. The information she gathered didn't stop the attacks, it only confirmed that she was living inside a historical wound that refused to heal. The research phase was over, and the realization was clear: you cannot negotiate with the history of the land. You can only survive it, or you can leave. Visual note: fade from archival newspaper clippings to a wide, lonely shot of the house at dusk. By the third month of their residence, the Sarro family reached a terminal point of desperation. The physical and psychological siege had moved beyond what any domestic unit could endure. Cindy, now physically frail from sleep deprivation and documented internal injuries, sought intervention from the only institutions left, the clergy and psychological experts. However, this phase, known as the climax, would prove that the house on the hill was not merely a spiritual problem, but a systemic, physical entity that resisted all forms of cleansing. Before any spiritual intervention was permitted, Cindy was required to undergo a rigorous psychological evaluation. In an era where such claims were often dismissed as hysteria, Cindy sought a clinical diagnosis to validate her sanity. The medical professional who conducted the evaluation reached a startling conclusion: Cindy Sarro was mentally sound, possessing high cognitive function and no signs of delusional disorders. However, the doctor noted that Cindy appeared to possess a heightened sensitivity to her environment. He officially cleared her for a religious consultation, stating that the physical injuries she presented, specifically the blunt force trauma to her kidneys, could not be explained by her own actions or a psychological condition. This was a critical turning point. The medical field had acknowledged that something external was happening. The religious intervention that followed was both formal and harrowing. Cindy eventually secured the help of a Catholic priest from Caseyville, who was joined by an experienced exorcist from St. Louis. Unlike the dramatic portrayals in cinema, this was a methodical, hours-long process of prayer and the application of holy water throughout every room of the house. The priests moved from the attic to the crawlspaces, invoking traditional rites of protection. Initially, a sense of sterile peace seemed to settle over the property. Cindy, desperate for a return to normalcy, contacted Glenn and brought her daughters back to the house, hoping the blessing had finally severed the connection to whatever was beneath the soil. The hope lasted less than an hour. The house on the hill did not just reject the blessing, it reacted with unprecedented violence. As Cindy sat at the kitchen table attempting to process the day's bills, the atmosphere turned glacial. The lights, which had been stabilized by the electrician, began a rapid, rhythmic pulsing. Suddenly, a scream erupted from the staircase. Cindy's daughter, Brooke, was physically pinned against the wooden stairs by an invisible weight. Unable to descend or ascend, as if the air around her had turned to solid stone. This was the moment Cindy's fear turned into a protective rage. She challenged the space directly, demanding it release her child. In response, the house delivered its final, devastating message. A sequence of rhythmic, heavy thuds, described as bam bam bam, erupted from within the walls, moving with terrifying speed from the basement to the living room. The dry wall between the children literally vibrated as if something was attempting to punch its way through from the other side. When Cindy retreated to the laundry room, she witnessed a phenomenon that defied the laws of fluid dynamics. The holy water that the priest had applied to the walls just hours earlier did not dry or drip downward. Instead, it surged off the surface of the wall and was thrown back at her arm with enough force to leave a wet, cold sting. The house was literally spitting back the symbols of its attempted cleansing. The final shattering occurred shortly thereafter. While Cindy was out of the room, a sound like a localized explosion echoed through the upper floor. She returned to find the entire ceiling of one room had collapsed. Not a slow sag from a leak, but a total, violent structural failure that sent insulation and plaster onto the floor. When a contractor was brought in to investigate the burst pipe they assumed caused the collapse, he found the pipes bone dry. There was no water damage, no wood rot, and no structural reason for the ceiling to have exploded outward. The contractor, visible shaken, informed Cindy that it looked as if the air pressure in the room had increased to the point of structural detonation. This was the breaking point. The priests refused to return. The local Caseyville priest famously hung up the phone on Cindy, stating he would never set foot on that hill again. The message was clear. The house was a total loss environment. The Sarro family realized that the climax was not a battle they could win. They were not fighting a spirit. They were living inside a predatory geographic anomaly that had survived for a century and would likely survive them. With the ceiling in ruins, the water black, and the clergy in retreat, Cindy Sarro made the only rational decision left. She gathered her children, walked out the front door, and did not look back. The shattering was complete, not just of the house's structure, but of the family's attempt to inhabit it. The house had won. The departure from the house on the hill was not a clean break, but a frantic retreat. Cindy Sarro and her daughters fled with only what they could carry, leaving behind a home that had transitioned from a domestic sanctuary to a site of documented trauma. Even after relocating to a new residence towns away, the echoes of Caseyville lingered. The aftermath of this case serves as a chilling reminder that some experiences do not end simply because the physical location has changed. Cindy remained in a state of hypervigilance for months, sleeping with a Bible open to Psalm chapter 91, paralyzed by the fear that the energy of the hill had attached itself to her family. The mystery of Daryl remains the most unsettling unresolved thread in the official narrative. After the family moved, Cindy learned through a series of coincidental conversations with her mother's landlord that a young man named Daryl had indeed lived in the area years prior. He was known to have associated with the previous owner's relatives, but there was a significant, dark detail. Daryl had been deceased for years before Cindy ever moved to the hill. If the man Cindy encountered in the vintage van was not a living person, it raises profound questions about the nature of the information he provided, specific dates of mining tragedies and hidden murders that were later verified in the archives. This encounter suggests that the house on the hill was part of a larger, liminal space where the past and present were no longer separate. In an effort to process the trauma and provide a warning to others, Cindy Sarro eventually authored a detailed account of her ordeal. Her book, which found its way into local libraries and even onto the shelves alongside prominent paranormal researchers, serves as the primary source of truth for this case. It provides a chronological roadmap of a family's disintegration and remains a key text for those studying the intersection of geology, history, and anomalous phenomena. Despite the sensationalism often found in television adaptations, Cindy has always maintained a strict adherence to the facts, the black water, the medical records of her injuries, and the structural explosion of the ceiling. For her, this was never about entertainment, it was about survival and the objective reality of a location that defied human habitation. Today, The house on the hill stands as a silent witness to those 3 months in 1991. Real estate records show a continued pattern of high turnover, a silent testament to the fact that the balance Daryl spoke of has never been restored. The land near Cannonball Hill remains a focal point for researchers who believe that certain geographic locations act as recorders of human suffering. Whether it was the coal mining disasters of 1881 or the military skirmishes of the Civil War, the soil in Caseyville seems to hold onto its scars with a violent tenacity. The Sarro case challenges our understanding of the physical world. It forces us to ask if a house can truly be predatory, or if we are simply intruding on spaces that belong to a history we no longer understand. Cindy Sarro didn't just lose a home, she gained a profound, terrifying perspective on the fragility of our perceived reality. The house on the hill may be a single address in Illinois, but its story is a universal warning about the shadows that live in the gaps of our history. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into one of the most harrowing accounts in the annals of Illinois history. The Sarro case leaves us with many questions that science and tradition struggle to answer. What part of this story stood out to you the most? Do you believe the history of the land can truly manifest in such a violent, physical way? Or do you think there is a more rational, environmental explanation for the black water and the structural collapses? We would love to hear your theories and insights in the comments section below. If you found this investigation insightful, please consider supporting the channel. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these complex, objective analyses to light. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our upcoming episodes. We are dedicated to bringing you the most well-researched and compelling stories from the edges of our reality. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next chapter.